Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Welcome back. Hello, Michael. How are you? And of course, Hydrate. Today, I have some more gamer sups. And as you can see, more tasting history. It's been a while. So, he's come out with quite a few videos since. Alright, first things first. The original Girl Scout cookie recipe. Gotta see this. Nope. You get no ad time here. Go away. Skip.
My niece sends me a text asking if I'll buy some Girl Scout cookies, and I always happily oblige. But while she's selling the cookies, she's not baking the cookies. But back in the early years of the Girl Scouts, each scout would bake her own cookies using this recipe from 1922. So thank you to my Patreon patron for sending me the idea to make these original Girl Scout cookies, this time on Tasting History. First, I wanted to let you know that when this video actually comes out, I will be in Europe doing some research for a few upcoming videos, so if you want to follow those travels, I'm going to mostly be posting on Instagram at Tasting History with Max Miller. Now here in the US, there is at least one thing that we can all agree on. Girl Scout cookies are fantastic. From trefoils to Thin Mints, Samoas to Tagalongs, ordering these cookies every year is a time-honored tradition. But when the tradition first began, the selection was rather meager. There was actually only one cookie available. It was this recipe, which was printed in the American Girl magazine in July 1922.
Well, a bit tired. Ooh, an arcade bar. I don't know if I have any of those near me. I'm doing alright. Same old, same old.
Attention Scouts! Forward march! Bake, sell! This is your chance to show how much scouting means to you. Girl Scout cookies. 1 cup of butter or substitute, 1 cup of sugar, 2 tablespoons of milk, 2 eggs, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 2 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder. Cream, butter, and sugar, add well-beaten eggs, then milk, flavoring, flour, and baking powder. Roll thin and bake in a quick oven. Sprinkle sugar on top. This amount makes 6 to 7 dozen. So essentially, it is a simple sugar cookie, which, if I'm not mistaken, is not actually one of the options for Girl Scout cookies today. But it had to be simple because it was the Girl Scouts themselves doing the actual baking. I don't think many young girls would be up for tempering chocolate to properly form a Thin Mint today. Also, the recipe needed to be simple because the Girl Scouts were under the scrutiny of the viewing public while they were doing the baking. Back in November of 1923, when the cookies were sold in the fall, a Massachusetts newspaper invited readers to do a good turn for your stomach. Buy Girl Scout cookies tomorrow. Watch the 16 Girl Scouts bake cookies in the window of the Lynn Gas and Electric Company. And
Wait, okay, so it's one thing that these girls would bake the cookies themselves, but people would come watch them? I mean, it's not exactly the most thrilling thing. They're just baking cookies. What do you expect? But really, though, people would come watch the Girl Scouts bake their own cookies. Okay.
encourage the future homemakers. Now, this public spectacle was partly to drum up enthusiasm for the Girl Scout cookies, but also partly because not everyone had an oven in their home at the time that was capable of baking a bunch of cookies. Luckily, I do have such an oven, so let's get to baking some cookies. First off, you need to make sure your butter is softened. Also, this recipe doesn't include any salt, and that's because they would have been using salted butter, so if you go for unsalted, make sure to add about a half teaspoon of salt in with the flour. So take your softened butter and cream it with the sugar in a bowl until it's nice and smooth. Then beat the eggs and incorporate them into the mixture, and once mixed, add in the milk and the vanilla and mix those in as well. In a separate bowl, whisk together the flour and baking powder, and if you're using it, the salt, and then add about half of that to the batter and gently mix by hand just until the flour is incorporated. Then add the rest of the flour and continue to mix. Now it's best to do this by hand just so you don't build up too much gluten in the flour. And here is where I can only imagine 100 years ago, many Girl Scouts were incredibly frustrated because the recipe says to roll this dough out, but it is absolutely not rollable. Even if you used very small eggs and heaping cups of flour, it is a very sticky dough right when you make it, so you can't roll it out without chilling it, which probably wouldn't have been an option for many people. I did chill it, and even then, it was still really hard to roll out. I had to put it between two pieces of parchment and add extra flour on the top, and yeah, it was rough. And this really bummed me out because I went on to eBay and bought this original, it's actually from the 1950s, trefoil cookie cutter, which was sent to people from Dripinator. Dripilator? I don't know, some coffee company. Anyway, I wanted to make like the original trefoil design, but it was not happening. I was finally able to get a few made after I froze the dough solid, but surely this was not the author's intent. I think much more effective than trying to roll this dough is to form the dough into balls and then set them onto a cookie sheet, leaving several inches between because they're going to spread quite a lot. Also, the recipe says this should make 6 to 7 dozen, which seems ambitious. I went with 6 dozen, and that means that each cookie is only going to be 9 grams, which is considerably smaller than the modern cookies. Whatever size you do decide to make them, set the cookie sheets in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius for 10 to 12 minutes or until they begin to brown around the edges. And as soon as you take them out, sprinkle plenty of sugar over the top while they are still warm. As I said, I tried to use this cookie cutter, but those cookies ended up spreading so much that they completely lost any shape, so I recut them when I took them out of the oven, but that is not ideal. That said, I was so intent on using this cookie cutter to make some trefoils that I ended up making some just kind of generic shortbread dough, which is what trefoils ended up being. So I did make some that held their shape pretty well. So in the end, I believe it was a worthwhile eBay purchase. But that is my cookie journey, and we're not here to talk about my cookie journey. We are here to talk about the cookie journey of the Girl Scouts.
Look on dollar.com to get our lowest rates.
Why are you... Nope, you get no ad time here. Back off. Oh, there's a part 2, of course.
The year was 1911, and Juliet Gordon Low, known to her friends as Daisy, was traveling around England. Following the death of her husband, she was looking for something to fill the void, to give her life a new purpose. She tried sculpture, she tried traveling, she tried charity work, but it wasn't until she met Sir Robert Baden-Powell at a party in May of that year that she realized what her life's work was meant to be. See, Baden-Powell was the man behind a group known as the Boy Scouts, and at this time his group had about 40,000 members throughout Europe and the US, and his enthusiasm for the program was contagious. Soon after becoming acquainted, Baden-Powell introduced Mrs. Low to his sister, Agnes, who headed up an offshoot of the Scouts known as the Girl Guides. This group taught young women everything from how to spin wool to care for livestock, to knitting, cooking, and even first aid. There was also a degree of military preparedness on the agenda, something the Boy Scouts focused on. This included everything from camping to military drills to signaling, and this, Mrs. Low realized, was her calling. So she went back to Savannah, Georgia in 1912, where she was from, and immediately contacted her cousin, saying, "I've got something for the girls of Savannah, and all America, and all the world, and we're going to start it tonight." And within weeks, she had formed the first 2 American Girl Guides patrols, consisting of 18 girls. Now, Low hoped to merge her guides with the larger group of Campfire Girls, which was run by James E. West, a man who also ran the Boy Scouts of America. But West considered many of the activities that Low wanted her girls to participate in, like the military drills and the camping, to be less than feminine. And so if her girls were doing the same activities as the Boy Scouts, what would that say about the masculinity of the Boy Scouts? Clearly, the man was rather insecure. But Low said to heck with the Campfire Girls and the Boy Scouts, and after consulting her British counterparts, established a new headquarters in Washington, D.C., began a recruiting program, and changed the name from the Girl Guides to the Girl Scouts, something James E. West tried to stop, worrying that the boys would abandon the Boy Scouts due to the similarity in name.
Wait, Did that guy actually try to take legal action to prevent the Girl Scouts from being formed? Damn, he's right. Max is right. That guy was insecure as hell.
Of course, he was wrong. Nobody abandoned the Boy Scouts because they had a similar name, and he failed to stop the name change anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The Girl Scouts were here to stay. They grew from 18 girls in 1912 to 5,000 in 1915 and to over 50,000 by the time that the cookie drive started in the early 20s. Now, technically, the first Girl Scout cookie sale was in 1917 in Muskogee, Oklahoma, when the Mistletoe Troop sold cookies in their local school cafeteria to raise some funds. But it was a one-off, and it wasn't necessarily part of the Girl Scouts as a whole, but it likely influenced the later, larger cookie sales. Those seem to have started in 1922 when a more organized cookie sale was established, though even then it was far from nationwide. It was more of a suggestion of a way to raise funds which appeared in the Girl Scouts magazine, The American Girl. It was a plan suggested by a local director of the Girl Scouts in Chicago, Illinois, a Miss Florence E. Neal. And it says, "All troops are asked to bake and sell cookies. We are enclosing recipe to be used, which makes 6 to 7 dozen. Material will cost from 26 to 36 cents. These cookies will sell for 25 to 30 cents a dozen, depending on your neighborhood. Several troops plan to use the money to start a camp fund. This is an excellent idea, and we would suggest that all troops do the same."
Honestly, looking at these prices, it's hard to imagine that nowadays. Materials for the cookies costing 26 to 36 cents? I don't know if you can buy a single egg today for that much. Like, a dozen eggs cost like a lot. And they're buying all these materials for fecking 26 to 36 cents. And 25 to 30 cents for like a dozen small cookies? Like, you couldn't buy a single cookie for 25 cents today.
This recipe, of course, is the one that we are baking today, and the author says that the cookies should be put into wax paper bags and then sealed with stickers with the Girl Scout logo. But it was important that the Girl Scouts didn't come off as common street urchins hawking their baked goods for a few pennies, so it instructed that cookies must not be sold in the street. Sell them at school or to your neighbors or friends, or have a cookie sale in your neighborhood store. But the best part of this first official cookie sale was neither the recipe nor the instructions on where to sell them, but the inclusion of a little poem that I can only suppose was meant to be recited to prospective customers. "Cookies large and cookies small, made by scouts both short and tall. What's your order? Phone us quick, so that we may do the trick. 30 cents is all we ask, and we find it is no task to deliver to your door dozens, 1, 2, 3, or more." I think I actually bought 18 dozen. Of course, they are for the purpose of filming this episode, so it's totally fine.
That's actually so good. Do they still like have that on file somewhere? Like, that should be an ad. That's a whole ass ad right there. That's brilliant.
Though you can bet that those Thin Mints will be in my freezer for the next couple months as I just slowly chip away at them. Anyway, it seems that, at least according to newspapers from the time, that first year of cookie sales was pretty limited, mostly in and around Chicago. But the next autumn, they really took off, and that's partly because of a cookie lover in the White House. "Girl Scout cookies for the president. A 5-foot bag of cookies baked by Manhattan Girl Scouts to be presented to the White House will be personally received by Mrs. Calvin Coolidge. The cookies are being baked according to the same recipe that the 1 million are treated to, one that has been approved not only by mothers, but also by grandmothers." The next week, newspapers ran images of the beloved First Lady Grace Coolidge eating one of the cookies that we are making today. But I ask you, did she like them? Well, if the Indianapolis Times is to be trusted, then Mrs. Coolidge likes Girl Scout cookies. My, but they are good, is what Mrs. Calvin Coolidge is saying as she eats one of the Girl Scouts cookies. Scouts will sell millions of these delicacies soon to collect enough money to build a new home and for the next year's expenses. And with the First Lady's endorsement, Girl Scout cookies took off. And with Prohibition in full effect, the nation was looking to the Girl Scouts to provide them with something to take the edge off. And the Scouts were happy to do so. Girl Scouts to flood the city with cookies. Cookies! Girl Scout cookies! Thousands of them! Crisp brown baked cookies. Saturday is the day of days for members of the Girl Scouts of Lynn. It will be their cookie day. From early morn until the supply is exhausted, Lynn will be swamped with cookies. As memberships in the Girl Scouts grew past 250,000 in the late 1920s, the sale of the cookies spread from one troop to another until in 1934 it came time to give the girls a break and turn the baking over to commercial bakeries. At the time, there were many, and they were licensed kind of city by city, and so there wasn't always complete uniformity between them. And even today, there are only 2 commercial bakeries now that bake them all, so they're more uniform, but the names are not, and I only learned this. So while I know Samoas and Tagalongs, in other parts of the country, they're called Caramel Delights and Peanut Butter Patties. Same cookies, totally different names, and I'm not exactly sure why. Like, I don't know.
Wait, what? This is the first I've heard of that. I had no idea. I think I know them as like Caramel Delights. That's the name that's coming up in my head right now. Samoas? That does sound every now and then I'll hear people talking about Girl Scout cookies and I'll be a little bit confused because I'll hear like Samoas and Caramel Delights and I'm like, wait, what? I had no idea. Why would they use different names?
It's absolute madness. Either way, neither of those cookies were around in the 1930s. At that time, one of the most popular cookies was the vanilla and chocolate wafer, which was said to be the favorite of then First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, though I think she's mad for not preferring the Kooky Mint, which premiered in 1939. This was a chocolate and mint cookie, which would later also be called the Cookie Mint, the just chocolate mint, and eventually the Thin Mint. Unfortunately, the Kooky Mint only had a couple years on the market before everything came crashing down as the United States entered World War II.
Nah, fuck off. Skip.
Of eggs, sugar, and flour forced the Girl Scouts to abandon cookie production altogether, and instead they sold calendars. Everyone loves a calendar, right? Yeah, not as much as cookies. But as soon as the war was over and the rationing ended, the cookies came back. And by 1951, many of the staple cookies that are still around today, like Do-si-dos, trefoils, and Thin Mints, were already available, though under the much less exciting names of sandwiches, shortbreads, and chocolate mints. As baby boomers began to enter the Scouts in the late 50s and 60s, the sale of cookies skyrocketed, and it's never really gone away. This is partly because they're always introducing new cookies while keeping the classics like the Samoa, which was introduced in the 1970s, but also because there is a level of scarcity. They're only available one time a year, and so people stock up. I remember as a kid, my mom buying many Thin Mints and just stuffing them into our freezer so that they would last through the end of summer. She was a Thin Mintaholic. It also helps that the sale of the cookies goes to support a good cause, the Girl Scouts. It also helps that the cookies are being sold by the Girl Scouts. I mean, if I'm standing outside of a store selling cookies, I don't think it would go as well as my niece standing outside of a store selling cookies. But, as I said, she is not baking the cookies, she's just selling them. I actually baked these cookies, and so I'm going to keep them all to myself. And with that, I'll let this PSA from 1976 let you know.
The cookies are here!
And here we are, the original Girl Scout cookies from 1922. Like I said, they're not huge. They're only 9 grams of dough, so they're very thin, but the nice sugar on top really helps. They smell good, so here we go. Nice and crispy. I mean, it's a sugar cookie, but it's a delicious sugar cookie. And I do like that they're nice and crisp. This is dangerous because these are the type of cookie that you can sit down and eat like 30 of without even noticing. I made 6 dozen. So I'll put this recipe up on the Tasting History website, tastinghistory.com, as I always do. Also, when you go there, you can sign up for the newsletter, which goes out once a month. And yeah, make some Girl Scout cookies or buy some Girl Scout cookies. Goes to a good cause. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Okay. What next? Medieval fast food. All right, let's do it. Let's hit up Mick. God damn it. MacArthur's.
We usually think of fast food as a modern invention, but it turns out that in the Middle Ages, most people didn't cook at home and actually relied on fast food that was served from public cookshops. They had everything from cooked meat to waffles to something called a risole, one version of which is the medieval equivalent of a McDonald's apple pie. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we make some medieval fast food, this time on Tasting History. In the 13th century, a French author named Guillaume de Villeneuve wrote something called The Cries of Paris, where he detailed the sights and sounds of the streets of medieval Paris. In it, he talks of the pre-cooked foods like hot mashed peas, meat pies, garlic sauce, and cheese from Champagne and Brie that was being sold at public cookshops. There were also sweets sold by street vendors who walked around in the evening with baskets covered with a white napkin filled with wafers, waffles, and risole. Now, any of those, the wafers, waffles, or the risoles, could be either sweet or savory. They actually had fish waffles at the time. And when it comes to the risole, which are kind of like a hand pie, the 14th century book Le Ménagier de Paris has several recipes for ones with pork, one with chestnuts and eggs, another with beef bone marrow, and another with pike or eel meat, all savory. But it is common that risole are made of figs, raisins, roast apples, and nuts peeled to imitate pine nuts, and powder of spices and a little fine salt. And let the paste be well saffroned, and then let them be fried in oil and sugar them. Now with sugar and spices, this would have definitely been a nicer menu item at any of the cookshops, and most of the cookshops actually geared their menu toward the common people, or even the poorer people, but there were some that did cater to the upper classes. Now, some of the spices used, things like sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg, those were expensive because they had to come all the way from Asia. But saffron was actually widely grown in Spain, France, and even into England during the Middle Ages. Now, it wasn't exactly inexpensive, but it was definitely more common than you might think. It was often used not just to flavor things, but to give a yellow tint to their foods. And that's actually how it's going to be used in this paste recipe, for which you will need 2.5 cups or 300 grams of flour, 12 tablespoons or 170 grams of butter cut into small cubes, 1/4 cup or 60 milliliters of water, and then a pinch of saffron. So first add the saffron to the water and let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then sift the flour into a large bowl and add in the butter, working with your fingertips.
Curious, what does sifting flour do? I just don't understand why you would sift flour. Like, what does it do for the cooking? Does it, like, filter out the larger flour chunks or something? Add air? You don't know? I don't know either, dude.
Tips, smear the butter into the flour until all of the butter is incorporated and you have a nice sandy texture. Then pour the saffron water through a strainer into the bowl and quickly work it in until it forms a dough. Once it all comes together,
If you were
Nope.
dough in either a damp cloth or plastic wrap and let it sit preferably in a cool place like a refrigerator for 10 to 15 minutes to rest while you make your filling. Now, if you want to emulate one of the poorer cook shops, then you're going to have to leave out all the sugar and spices. But if you want to be like one of the wealthier cook shops, then what you'll need is 1/2 cup or 120 grams of dried figs, a 1/4 cup or 30 grams of raisins, 6 medium-sized apples, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/2 teaspoon of ginger, a 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, a 1/2 cup or 100 grams of sugar, 1 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/2 cup or 60 grams of chopped walnuts, almonds, or hazelnuts. And I found it interesting because it says to use nuts to imitate pine nuts, but pine nuts were rather common in Europe during the Middle Ages, so I'm not entirely sure why it says that, but there you go. So that is what you need for the filling, which then we will stuff into the pastry the same way that you'll stuff your feet into the comfy socks from today's sponsor, Bombas. Bombas produces some of the comfiest socks, underwear, shirts, and slippers that I have ever come across. And the first thing to do for your filling is to chop the figs into small pieces and then mix them with the raisins and...
Oh, okay, let's see. Putting flour through a sifter will break up any lumps. Lighter and airier, easier to mix. Oh, okay.
Soak them for about an hour. Now you can soak them either in water, or if you want to follow a 14th century English recipe from the form of curry, they call for them to be soaked in wine. It probably would have been a sweet wine, so that's what I'm using. As they soak, core the apples and cut them in half and set them on a baking sheet and then roast them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius for 30 minutes or until they are nice and soft. Then let them cool and chop them into small pieces just like the figs. Then in a large bowl, whisk together the spices with the salt and the sugar, and then add in the apples, as well as the figs and raisins which have been drained from their water or wine, and toss everything to coat. Now for this next part, I actually had to look at several other recipes for risole from the period because it wasn't clear what the texture should be like. I was going to leave them kind of in big chunks, so it would be more like a modern apple pie, but most of those old recipes talk about grinding up either the meat or the fruit, depending on which you make, so it's more of a paste inside, so that's what I'm going to do. So take some of the filling and put it into a mortar and grind it until in the end you have something relatively smooth. Then you can add in the nuts, which should give it some texture, though I still don't think they look anything like pine nuts. Then unwrap your dough and divide it into about a dozen equally sized pieces and form it into balls. Then on a floured surface, roll one piece of the dough out into a rough circle about 1/8 of an inch thick and take a couple tablespoons of the filling and set it in the center of the dough, leaving plenty of dough around the edges. Then fold it over the filling and start to pinch the dough together. And really these can be any shape that you want, but I found that this half moon shape was the easiest. Once the dough is pressed together, use a fork to seal the edge and then set the risole aside and continue until all of the dough is used up. Then when it comes to the frying, lard would have been the most popular fat to use at the time, but anything will work for these. All you need is about 3 or 4 inches worth in a deep pot, and heat it up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius, and then carefully set 3 or 4 risole in at a time. Let them fry for about 5 minutes, but keep them moving around fairly often, lest they burn to the bottom of the pot. After 5 minutes, or when they're well colored, you can take them out of the oil and set them on a rack to dry and sprinkle them while they're still hot with a bit of sugar. And it's because of that sugar and the spices that are in these risole that makes it so these would have been sold at a nicer cook shop, similar to the cook shop that is mentioned in a London writing from 1170. There is in London, on the river bank, among the ships, the wine for sale, and the vintners' cellars, a public cook shop. Every day, according to the season, you will find dishes of meat, roast, fried, or boiled, fish, large and small, coarser meat for the poor, finer cuts for the rich, game and fowl, large and small. That was William Fitzstephen, who was writing around the year 1170. And actually, Fitzstephen is probably most famous for being present at the death of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket, who was allegedly murdered when King Henry well, he wasn't allegedly murdered, he was definitely murdered, allegedly on the orders of King Henry II, who was a former friend of his when Henry sent 4 knights to Canterbury Cathedral to murder the Archbishop. Well, Fitzstephen was present when that happened.
Ah, I never thought I'd be hearing that today. The king ordered knights to go and murder his old friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Okay.
And later on, he actually wrote a biography of the then Saint Thomas of Becket. But the writing that I think is most interesting is a writing that he wrote about the city of London, just detailing what it was like at that time. Not only does he talk about the Publica Coquina, or public cookshop, but he tells us where in the city it is and says that it caters to both the poor and the wealthy, and he gives us an idea of why wealthy people would be eating at a place like this. If friends unexpectedly arrive at the home of some citizen, and they, weary and hungry after their journey, prefer not to wait until food is bought and cooked, or till servants bring water for hands and bread, they can instead pay a quick visit to the riverside, where anything they might desire is immediately available. So it's kind of like you have company over and you don't really want to cook anything, so you're just going to order Thai for the third time this week. But instead of Masaman curry, he says that those with a fancy for delicacies can obtain for themselves the meat of goose, guinea hen, or woodcock. Finding what they're after is no great chore, since all the delicacies are set out in front of them. And those are definitely meats meant for the wealthier classes. And this is probably why this cookshop in particular was worth mentioning in Fitzstephen's writings, because most cookshops catered to the common city dwellers. For most people living in towns and cities, cooking at home was not usually an option. Most people didn't have kitchens at all. They might have a hearth, and many of those people didn't own a pot in which to actually cook anything. For instance, in 1301, in the city of Colchester, only 3% of tax-paying households had any kind of kitchen, and records show that many of the poorest citizens didn't own a pot or any cooking utensils with which to cook their food. So they relied on these public cookshops.
That's something I do not remember hearing in my medieval history classes. Most houses not having, like, a hearth or cooking utensils. Imagine that nowadays, like, people not having stoves in their houses, they have to, like, go out and eat all the time. That's something.
Now these would be quite different from getting served at a tavern or an alehouse where you would sit down and possibly have a full meal. Instead, most shops were either small lean-to sheds or just a cart. They even had carts fitted with mobile ovens for baking small pies. And in many towns, the streets that housed these shops would come to be called cockrow, or cook's row. We can get a better idea of what was sold at these cookshops from a 1450 poem called London Lickpenny. It's about a poor countryman from Kent who comes to London and is immediately beset upon by the owners of these cookshops. Then to Westminster Gate I presently went, when the sun was at high prime. Cooks to me they took good intent, and proffered me bread with ale and wine, ribs of beef both fat and full fine. Then unto London I did hie, of all the land it beareth the price. Hot peas cod one began to cry, strawberry ripe, and cherries in the rice. One bade me come near and buy some spice, pepper and saffron they gan me bead, but for lack of money I might no speed. In other parts of the city he's offered hot pies and mead and hot sheep's feet. I do find it interesting though that it specifically mentions pepper and saffron being sold. He couldn't afford it, but at least we know that it was available in cities at the time.
Nope, no ad time for you people today.
But many specialized in just like one item of food. From the Court Leet Rolls of Norwich in 1287, it mentions one cookshop that only sold pork sausages and puddings, while another sold only cheese and egg custards, and another only sold mustard. Many cookshops specialized in selling sauces, like galantine, which is made from galangal from Southeast Asia. And even the wealthier houses would often get their sauces from these shops because it was just cheaper to buy a little sauce, kind of pre-made, rather than getting your own very expensive spices in bulk. Also, these cookshops were kind of the only way that your average citizen was ever going to get to try spices at all. In a treatise from 1300, it talks about a seller of meat and fish pasties which were, in Latin, bene piperatos. Now, pasties and pies were probably the most common food that was sold at these shops, and you could just go buy a pie fully made. They would always have fresh hot pies ready to sell. Or you could go to a poulterer or butcher and buy some meat, take it to the pie maker, and tell them that you wanted to take that and make it into a pie. Then they would wrap it in pastry and bake it. Now, why exactly would you do this? Was it to save money, perhaps? Maybe. In London in 1350, a regulation stipulated that no cook shall take more for putting a capon or rabbit in a pasty than 1 penny, on pain of imprisonment. So essentially, you're paying a penny for...
Wow. You could not overcharge, like, for... and the punishment was imprisonment? Hang on, let me go back like a few seconds. No cook shall take more for putting a capon or rabbit in a pasty than 1 penny on pain of imprisonment. Damn, no overcharging, or else jail.
pain of imprisonment. So essentially, you're paying a penny for the pie to be made, but you've had to go buy the capon, which on average at the time cost 6 pennies. So it was 7 pennies. But if you bought it pre-made, it was also 7 pennies. The prices were pretty much fixed at the time, so the costs didn't really change unless it was much smaller or much larger. There were times, depending on the meat, that you might save a penny, but still, I don't think it was the cost that really made people do this. I think you provided your own meat because you didn't know what was in a pie that had already been made. In 1351, for instance, a man named Henry Pesce accused a cook named Henry de Passelway of a heinous crime. Pesce and his friend had purchased 2 capon pasties from the cook, and the court records recalled that Henry Pesce and his companions, being hungry, did not perceive that one of the 2 said capons was putrid and stinking, until they had eaten almost the whole thereof. Whereupon they opened the second capon, which he produced here in court, and found it to be putrid and stinking, and an abomination to mankind. The cook, of course, denied this accusation, and so they called 8 other cooks from the area to investigate that capon pie, and they came to the conclusion that it was rancid. And so the court decreed that Henry de Passelway should have sentence of the pillory, there to remain for the space of 1 league's journey in the day, and that the capon, which had been so found to be putrid and stinking, should be carried before the said Henry de Passelway on his way to the pillory. Now, at first, I was thinking that this system is just rife for issues. Like, if you didn't like a cook for some reason, you would just accuse them of giving you rotten meat, and they would end up in the pillory. But it turns out that if those 8 other cooks came in and decided that the meat was not rotten, then the person who had done the accuser, they would have gone to the pillory. So in either case, someone's going to the pillory. So the stakes were rather high, and it's because we need to remember just how precious and expensive food was at this time. Today, I feel like we are so removed from the production and sometimes even the cooking of our food that we don't realize just how much work and expense goes into it. And especially at a time before industrialization and a lot of government subsidies, food was the majority of a lot of people's income. During the Middle Ages, it could be 70 to 80% of the average person's wages just to feed themselves. Take one of those capon pies, for example. It was 7 pennies, which sounds cheap until you realize that the average laborer in a city made 2 to 3 pennies a day. So that pie would have cost them like 3 days' wages. Now, it would have been a big pie.
Still though, like 70 to 80% of your income to food? I think nowadays, like, most of people's, like, a lot, like, the biggest cost to people is like rent or something, or like, paying the mortgage or whatever. Damn, could you imagine if like most of your paycheck was taken up by food?
Was all of the meat of a large capon, a large castrated rooster. But it was still out of the reach of most people. Now, they did make smaller penny pies, usually from less expensive meats, that would be available to everyone. And during times of extreme hardship, like when a harvest failed, the government would come in and usually put price caps on how much different things could be charged for. Like in 1379, London pie sellers were ordered to bake pasties of beef at 1 halfpenny, just as good as those at a penny. And should they not follow that rule, then the cook would actually be forced to pay 80 pence, or a half mark, which was a lot of money. So sucks to be the cook, that just kind of losing out in that transaction. And that is probably why cooks were so often accused of selling bad meat, or meat that they probably should have tossed away, or swapping in inferior meat for something more expensive, like they would be selling a venison pasty, but it turned out just to be beef or pork. And when you look at court records from this time, a lot of them have to do with these food issues. Like one would be accusing somebody of selling bad fish inside of a pie, and another one would say that the pork was parasitic, which is gross, but that popped up a lot. Or another one would claim, one of the worst offenses, that the food had been reheated. There were a lot of ordinances against selling reheated food because it was usually reheated as a way to hide the fact that it was old and probably should have been tossed out. Another ordinance that kind of head this off at the pass was against cooks going to the houses of the wealthy and purchasing leftovers, especially offal, because usually that would have been around for some time before it got into the cook's hands.
Audiences are loving the image.
Yep, I don't give a damn.
Often, when you look at the court rolls, when people do get accused of this, they pass the buck. They pass the blame on to the cook's assistant, or very often their wife or their wife's friends who were helping out, and they're the ones that made the mistake. And this led in York to an ordinance in 1424 which dictated that the wives of any other artisans should not bake, boil, nor roast food in public shops for sale unless they are competent to do so. But blame the wives all you want, the buck stops with the head cook, and so it's no wonder that during the Middle Ages, cooks very often had a somewhat sullied reputation. And this can be seen in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where one of the characters, Roger of Ware, is a cook at one of these public shops in London. It says that his shop is filled with flies, his pastry is soggy, and he makes this parsley sauce that is so bad that it's basically a curse, and it says he sells pies that hath been twice hot and twice cold. That is, he reheats his food, one of the worst offenses. On top of that, it describes him as having an ulcer or an open wound on his leg that's always seeping, which is really gross. So it's no wonder that if you were able to afford to not frequent these shops, you wouldn't frequent these shops. But there were times when even people who had money, who had servants, who had a kitchen, would end up patronizing these cook shops. One might be because you're traveling and you've just come to town. Now, a lot of people would travel with some cooks and food and everything, but it didn't always happen. Like on June 1st in 1267, when Sir Roger Leyburn with a party of knights arrived in Canterbury from France, their first stop was to buy 68 capon pasties for 16 shillings tuppence from the local cook shop. Another reason was because of events. Even if you had a kitchen, unless you were in a castle, it wasn't big enough to cook a bunch of food for 100 guests or so. So if you were having a wedding or a funeral or a guild dinner, you would have to get catering essentially from these cook shops. And in England and France and much of Europe, cooks' guilds forced you to use their services if you were having one of these large events. So that was the time that you just needed to make sure you found a cook shop with a good reputation. Now, I am not hosting a guild feast of any kind, and I'm not too worried about rotten meat in this kitchen since I'm doing the cooking, so I think it is time to try these rissoles from 14th century France. And here we are, fig and apple rissoles from medieval France. I have to say, these turned out way better than I thought they would. I thought I would have trouble with the frying, but they all turned out really well. The color is nice, they didn't break open and leak, they smell really good. Here we go. That pastry is really good. That's delicious. So the inside, like I said, is it's firmed up. It's like ground up, and I do think that that ends up having a better texture than if I had let the pieces of apple and everything stay whole. But the flavor is fantastic. It's really, really good. I'm not sure that soaking them in wine, the figs and raisins in wine, made a big difference. So I'd probably just stick to water next time. Because the flavor that you're getting is from those spices, and you can use different spices if you want. I chose cinnamon and ginger and nutmeg, but you could use mace or clove or really whatever you want that they would have had at the time. But the apples and the nuts, all the flavors are there, and they complement each other really, really well. These are really, really good. So the fact that I like these so much means that I am safe from a medieval proverb that says, "He is an evil cook that cannot lick his own lips." That is, if the cook ain't willing to eat his own food, then maybe you don't eat that food either. So make these. They're delicious, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Still though, 70 to 80% of your income going to food. That is ridiculous. Yeah, can I get 2 double bacon meat pies and a large ale and a sausage biscuit, please? So what I'm learning is that Prince Charming could have actually ordered the medieval meal in Shrek 2. I hope people went up to the window and said, "Let me get, with a whole line behind him, a universal human experience." Hang on, there was one that got my attention. School lunch pizza, let's do it. School cafeteria pizza from the 80s and 90s. Don't give a damn. Skip.
90s here in the US, then you probably remember Pizza Day at school. For me, it was always on Fridays. And it wasn't just any pizza, but the iconic rectangular pizza that I'll be making today using the original recipe from 1988. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for keeping me flush with ideas for this channel as we go back to middle school for Pizza Day, this time on Tasting History.
I don't think we had pizza day at my school.
So I don't usually cover history from the 80s and 90s or anything that
Hang on, I'm trying to remember my childhood. You think you've seen this one? I haven't, so... I'm trying to remember my, school lunches. I don't think we had a, dedicated pizza day. What I remember is that, I think the schools would get these, frozen, mini pizza things and just heat them up, I think. That's what I remember.
that recent here on the channel, but when somebody posted on the Tasting History Reddit page the original recipe for this pizza that I so loved in elementary and middle school, I decided that I just had to make it. So this is an episode of Tasting My History. So the recipe comes from a 1988 booklet which was distributed to schools all over the US called Quantity Recipes for School Food Service from the United States Department of Agriculture. And it has recipes for all of your late 20th century school favorites like instant mashed potatoes.
Hang on. Let me go back a few seconds.
It has recipes for all of your late...
Back up a little bit more. Quantity Recipes for School Food Service by the USDA. I mean, I guess it would be, considering schools are, taxpayer, government-funded, public.
Culture. And it has recipes for all of your late...
Ground beef and macaroni with Mexican seasoning.
20th century school
Country fried steak? What?
favorites like instant mashed
potatoes,
sloppy
Joe,
joes, or Salisbury
a Salisbury steak? What?
steak, children.
It's Salisbury Steak Day.
But my favorite was the square pizza, or really rectangular pizza. And there are a few variations when it comes to how they made this pizza, the first being the crust. For pizza dough, use pizza crust recipe, see B14, or pourable pizza crust recipe, see B15. Pourable pizza crust, you say? Well, I am intrigued. Now, I don't know if my lunch lady used this recipe or if she did the regular pizza crust, but I want to make pourable pizza crust, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, the recipe calls for 100 servings. I don't need 100 servings of pizza, so I'm going to reduce it to 10 servings of pizza, for which you will need 2.5 teaspoons or 7 grams of active dry yeast, 1 2/3 cup or 375 milliliters of warm water, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 2.5 cups or 320 grams of all-purpose or bread flour, 3/4 of a cup or 55 grams of instant non-fat dry milk, 2 tablespoons or 25 grams of sugar, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1.5 teaspoons of vegetable oil plus more for greasing the pan, and 1.5 tablespoons or 15 grams of cornmeal. So first, dissolve the dry yeast into the water and let it sit for 5 minutes. While it sits, add the flour, dry milk, sugar, and salt in a stand mixer and mix using the whisk attachment on low for 4 minutes. I'm not sure exactly why it has you whisk it for so long at this point since there is no liquid in it yet, but that's what the recipe says, so that's what I'm doing. After 4 minutes, add the yeast, which should be nice and frothy, and the vegetable oil to the dough, or actually it calls it a batter, and continue to mix on a medium speed for 10 minutes. And while it mixes, you can get your pan ready. Now, the recipe actually calls for 5 sheet pans, but sheet pans are actually massive. They're not going to fit in a home oven. So the ones that we use at home, even the large ones, are half sheet pans. So that's what I'm going to use, and I'm only going to use one of them, which will be for 10 servings. So coat the half sheet pan in a little more oil, and then sprinkle the top with cornmeal, trying to get it evenly distributed. Once the batter is ready, pour it into the pan and spread it out to cover the base. Now, I really thought I screwed up here because there is no way that this amount of dough was going to cover the bottom of the pan, but I left it for a couple of minutes and it sort of relaxed, and I eventually had a nice thin layer of dough all over. That's probably why the recipe says to let the dough sit for 20 minutes while you preheat your oven to 475 degrees Fahrenheit or 425 if you are using a convection oven. That's 245 degrees or 218 degrees Celsius for those of you not living in the US or in the other handful of countries that still uses Fahrenheit. I see you, my friends, in the Federated States of Micronesia. So once the dough is sat for 20 minutes, set it in the oven and bake for 10 minutes or 7 minutes if you are using convection. Now at this point, the dough should be pre-baked. It's not fully baked through, but it's going to have some more time in the oven once we've added our toppings. And when it comes to toppings, we have a couple of options. There is the pizza with cheese topping and one for pizza with ground beef topping. Now maybe my school never had the ground beef topping, or maybe I just never got it. I can't honestly remember, but I do only remember eating this as a cheese pizza, so that's the one that I'm going to make. So for that, what you'll need is 1 tablespoon and 2 teaspoons or 12 grams of dried onions, a half teaspoon of garlic powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper, a half cup plus 2 tablespoons or 160 grams of tomato paste, 1 1/3 cups or 330 milliliters of water, 2 teaspoons dried basil, 2 teaspoons dried oregano, 1 1/2 teaspoons dried marjoram, a half teaspoon dried thyme, and 5 1/4 cups or 565 grams of mozzarella cheese shredded. If you do want to make the ground beef version, then just cut the amount of cheese in half and replace it with just under a pound of ground beef that you cook before putting it onto the pizza. But for the cheese version, you start by mixing the onions, garlic powder, pepper, tomato paste, water, and the seasonings in a saucepan, and then bring it to a simmer on the stove, and let it simmer for about 10 minutes. While it simmers, spread 1.5 cups of the cheese over the pizza crust, and then once the sauce has simmered for 10 minutes, pour that over the cheese, smoothing it out evenly. Again, it didn't really seem that there was going to be enough sauce, but there was, though as I spread it, I sort of messed up the cheese, and it seems that this was actually a problem even back in 1988, because in later recipes from the 90s, they just have you add that 1.5 cups of cheese to the sauce before putting it on. It probably makes it a lot easier. Once the tomato sauce is spread to the edges of the pan, sprinkle the remaining cheese evenly over the top. Now, if you recall, these pizzas did not have a crust around the edge like a round pizza, so you want to get the cheese all the way to the edge of the pan. Then pop that in the oven at 475 degrees Fahrenheit for 50 if you're using convection, and let it bake until it is lightly browned on top. The original recipe says it should bake for 15 to 18 minutes, but for me that was going to be way too long. It only took about 11 minutes to get brown on top, and I think that's just because I'm making 1/10 of the original quantity, so just keep an eye on it. Now, there are two other interesting things in this booklet that I wanted to share. First are the garnishes. It gives instructions on how to make carrot ribbons or curls, celery fans, radish roses, onion mums, radish tulips, or a tomato rose. And personally, I don't ever remember my lunch lady making us any radish roses. And frankly, I think it's kind of unfair to expect an already very busy lunch lady or lunch man to make radish roses for a bunch of 6-year-olds. Kind of a waste of time, but if they did that at your school, let me know. The other interesting bit is that after each recipe, it tells you how much each serving of the dish equals servings of meat, vegetable, and bread. Like when it comes to our cheese pizza, not the meat pizza, but the cheese pizza, one piece provides the equivalent of 2 ounces of cooked lean meat, 1/4 cup of vegetable, and 2 servings of bread. And that's really what school lunch was all about. It was making sure that the kids got enough servings of meat, vegetable, and bread, or nutrients in general. Or at least that was the goal, though it didn't always happen, as can be seen by the lunches of the late 20th century.
This really big deal is good.
Nope. Back off. No ad time here for you. Go away. Do you have a lunch lady or a lunch man or both? I only remember lunch ladies. I don't remember, like, a guy ever doing that. Not to my recollection. I could be wrong, but I generally remember the lunch ladies. Also hydrate, I see that.
Last year I did a video on the history of school lunch, and it focused mostly on the history pre-1960. So I decided that this would be a good chance to fill in some of the gaps post-1960. And the first thing that I found actually came from a comment left on that video about how the Black Panther Party influenced the school breakfast program. See, in the late 1960s, a study came out showing that kids who didn't have breakfast didn't do as well in school. They were tired, they would fall asleep, they couldn't concentrate. Kind of makes perfect sense, enough that you wouldn't even think you'd need a study to show you that, but they did. And it also showed that most of these kids were in poorer neighborhoods where they didn't have breakfast in the morning, usually because they couldn't afford it. So in 1969, the Black Panther Party started a program at a church in Oakland, California that provided free breakfasts to children who needed them. That first day, there were only 11 kids that showed up, but by the end of that first week, 135 kids were participating every day. The success of the program was so great that the party decided that they would have all of their chapters repeat it. So This breakfast program that the Black Panthers were doing was happening all over the country, and it got really, really big. So big that it grabbed the attention of the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who hated the Black Panthers.
Oh. Like these, I don't know too much about the Black Panthers, but what they're doing here, like they're just providing like free breakfast to kids, and like the director of the FBI has some kind of issue with that.
He hated pretty much everything. And this program that gave children free breakfast was so successful that Hoover decided it needed to be stopped. The program represents the best and most influential activity going for the BPP, and as such is potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the BPP and destroy what it stands for. Nice guy, that J. Edgar. He began a campaign that spread rumors that the Black Panthers were poisoning the breakfasts, and that didn't work. So instead, he just had police go in and bust the places up, destroying all of the food before it could be served to the kids. Unfortunately, it was effective, and it led to the program being discontinued and breaking up. But it had already become so popular that it couldn't go away. That program went away, but the kids' desire for breakfasts did not. So it gave a big boost to another program that had already been in effect since 1966 but hadn't really taken off. And that was a government-run program called the School Breakfast Program, which Congress permanently authorized in 1975. Though it also came under fire only 6 years later when big budget cuts hit the government, and it did stick around and is still around today, but even today it remains a political football. But it was during these budget cuts early on in the Reagan administration that led to another rather infamous lunch claim that the government was going to consider ketchup a vegetable. Now, how this came about was that during discussions at the USDA about how they could keep kids fed in light of these budget cuts to the school lunch program, they had a meeting where ideas could be freely tossed around. Anything goes. It was kind of one of those meetings where it's like, just say what you're thinking, there are no bad ideas. Well, one person had the idea to change the nutrition standards a little bit, which would allow relish and ketchup to be considered a vegetable. Now that was a bad idea, and unfortunately somebody wrote it down and it didn't get removed. Now it never actually became policy, but the whole ketchup is a vegetable thing did get out into the public, and there was severe blowback, rightly so. As one senator criticized, this is one of the most ridiculous regulations I ever heard of, and I suppose I need not add that I do know something about ketchup and relish, or did at one time. And the reason he says that he knows something about ketchup and relish is that that senator was Henry J. Heinz III of the Heinz ketchup family. But officially, the government never actually considered ketchup to be a vegetable. That is not to say that there were not other dubious claims made to the school lunch program. Going back all the way to 1975, there was a pilot program started first in Las Vegas, and then that spread to New York, Milwaukee, and several other cities, where schools began changing their lunch menus to more mimic the fast food that was becoming popular with the students. This led to menus with beef and cheese tacos, cheese pizzas, a meat and bean-filled burrito, a corn dog, fried chicken, and all-beef hamburger. Hard-boiled eggs, cottage cheese, and a chef's salad are also available. They also had a new alternative to milk, which the USDA signed off on as an approved alternative to milk, and it was called the Super Shake, which was essentially a milkshake, but they didn't use ice cream. But it did use emulsifiers and stabilizers that impart the creamy texture. The finished shakes are 96.75% fat-free, which would not be possible if they were made with ice cream. To meet the requirement of kids needing to have a vegetable on their plate, they gave the children two options: a salad or French fries. And not shocking to anyone, the number of students choosing salad over fries has to be considered negligible. The thing is, these were actually the healthy meals. These were the meals that hit all the standards that would allow them to be reimbursed by the US government. But there were other meals being offered that did not meet these standards. And so many students were seen taking lunches such as 2 cinnamon buns and a Coke, 4 sugar cookies and Sprite, 2 bags of French fries and a milkshake, or simply a glass of soda. And yet, even with these criticisms, the Las Vegas high school lunch was superior to most of the 135 sampled around the country several years ago.
What?
But neither the fast foodification of the 1970s nor the budget cuts of the 1980s would compare to what happened to school lunches in the 1990s, when I was eating them. See, in the 1970s, they tried to mimic the fast food of the time. But in the 1990s, new regulations were put in that let the fast food companies just come right on into the schools. There were branded products from McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Pizza Hut, you name it, it was there. Now, not every school had this. My school never did, and at the time, we kids did not like that. But in hindsight, probably a good thing. But by the year 2000, 1 out of 5 schools in the US had some of these branded products. Now, it does seem that the late 90s and early 2000s were kind of the worst period nutritionally for
I don't think my school ever had that. Like, I don't recall ever having, like, branded products. No, wait. I remember in elementary school, we would occasionally have Wiener Schnitzel brand chili cheese dogs. That was it. That was the only, like, branded thing I can recall. Outside of that, there were no, like, McDonald's or Pizza Hut or anything. There was pizza, but it was just like generic, just pizza. That was the only thing I can remember. The Wiener Schnitzel, like, chili cheese dog.
American school lunches, with about 35% of the calories coming from fat. But eventually, schools began to fight back. Even when I was in high school, there was a push to get rid of the vending machines. And they either got rid of them while I was there or just after, I can't really remember. Anyway, in the last couple of decades, there has been an effort to make school lunches here in the US more nutritious, and in some places they certainly have. But it is still definitely a point of contention and political debate. But that is Food Present, and I am all about food history. So let us travel back in time to 1988, when a 5-year-old Max walked into Madison Heights Elementary to try his first slice of square pizza.
What's for dinner? Shop.
Nope. Back off. You get no ad time today.
As baked, take it out of the oven and cut it into slices. I had planned on doing 10 slices, but it turns out cutting that into 10 was going to be kind of wonky, so I cut them into 9. And here we are, school lunch from 1988. So it smells just like it did 30 some odd years ago. Let's see if it tastes that way too. Memories from the corners of my mind. That's my best Barbra Streisand.
He's having like a Ratatouille moment right now.
Tastes just like it. You can, like, all of those herbs are exactly the same as they were.
He's having a Ratatouille moment.
I think maybe it tastes a little fresher than I remember. Like, the flavors are a little heightened, but that's them. This is the pizza. And that's the dough. That pourable dough. That must be what they were using at my school, because that is the dough. I also love that today I would never think of drinking chocolate milk with pizza, but in middle school, I always had chocolate milk with pizza. They were smaller. I searched for a carton that was smaller, and I couldn't find it. I was told by my sister, who recently stopped teaching elementary school, that her school still has the little cartons, and that I should just go to an elementary school and ask for a carton, but I thought that might be weird, so I got a big one. It's good. Still goes with pizza. I should have made all 100 slices. So if you are nostalgic for this pizza, might I suggest you make it? It's pretty cool to taste this flavor, because I don't think they make it anymore, at least not like this at schools. And kudos to all of the lunch ladies and lunch men out there today and from my past. They do They do the good work. Oh, also, something that my sister reminded me of about the chocolate milk. Does anyone else remember there was a period of like 1 or 2 years in many schools where they switched from the cartons to these bags of milk, either regular or chocolate milk, and it was like a clear bag. It was like a bladder of milk. It was kind of gross. You just stuck the straw in like a Capri Sun, but on its side. Does anyone remember that? Because I remember it, she remembers it, but none of our friends seem to.
I definitely remember that. Oh my god. I remember it was in elementary school. We had like bags of like milk, chocolate milk, and apple juice, and you would either like stick a straw right in the middle of it, or you would like just tear off a quarter with your teeth and just spray it into your mouth. That's what I remember. Oh my god, yes, I totally remember that. Oh, I actually, now that I think about it, I didn't see like cartons of milk or juice until I was in high school. Like all through elementary school and middle school, I grew up with like the bagged milk and juice. I don't know why they did that, but that's what they did. Oh man, this video. I was not expecting a nostalgia trip today.
So we were thinking maybe we were crazy. Anyway,
You are not
let me know
crazy. You are not crazy, Max. I remember that.
in the comments, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Oh my god, I totally remember that. Retired lunch lady here went from making everything from scratch to serving pre-made, pre-packaged items. We were always so happy to serve our scratch-made meals. Friday was always pizza day. Thursday was fresh fried chicken. Tuesday was chicken tenders or nuggets. He had a whole ass like Ratatouille moment there when he was taking a bite of that pizza. His childhood rushing back to him taking a bite of that pizza. Let's see. Someone here says grandmother was a school lunch lady, prepared these pizzas and the likes her entire life. Not a glamorous job, but she took pride in it. Oh, I'm not the only one. Cue the Ratatouille Anton Eagle childhood flashback. He had a whole ass Ratatouille moment. You vaguely remember occasionally they served juice or had juice for people who were lactose intolerant. But yeah, like definitely remember fecking like the little plastic baggies filled with juice or milk. Oh my god. Okay, one last video. The myth and truth behind croissants. Alright, let's go for it. Let's get a croissant. Nope. Blah blah blah, blah blah blah, waiting for the skip button. Goodbye.
Buttery, flaky croissant. Not much, I can tell you that. But it turns out that both the butter and the flake are relatively new additions to the croissant because neither were there when they first became popular, as can be seen in this French recipe from the 1850s. So thank you to Wild Grain for sponsoring this video as we learn the true and not so true origins of the croissant, this time on Tasting History.
Croissant.
Before we get started, I just wanted to point out that the French translation of the Tasting History Cookbook is out, so if you speak French, that's the one to get. Also, if you are looking for behind-the-scenes content, because people are always asking for behind-the-scenes stuff, it is all over on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, so go check me out over there. Now, the croissant has gone through several stages in its life, from the early days of the sweet Viennese Kipfel to the decadent cronut that took New York by storm in 2013. So when deciding which version to make for the episode, I had a few different options, but I ended up going with one of the first versions that would have actually been called a croissant, or as the French say, croissant. And while not strictly a recipe, one of the first descriptions of this new pastry came in 1853 by French chemist Anselme Payen, who categorized the croissant as a pain de fantaisie. In luxury bakeries, small loaves called croissants are prepared, usually in the semicircular shape of a roll curved and tapered at the ends. The liquid used to form the dough with 1 kilogram of flour consists of 1 or 2 eggs beaten and mixed with about 500 grams of water. Moreover, the choice of flour, the dough...
Who the hell measures water in grams? Seriously, who the hell measures water in grams? Who measures any liquid in grams and not, like, milliliters?
of yeast, as well as the working of the dough, require the same care as when it comes to the other luxury breads mentioned. One of those other luxury breads he mentions is pain viennois, which instead of just water uses 3 parts milk to 1 part water. It is leavened with a sponge, which is a type of pre-ferment, and includes salt, but still no butter. Butter actually won't come around for some decades. So using these early descriptions, I'm going to try to recreate that mid-19th century croissant that does not use butter, and it should be a lot easier than making the modern version, which requires a lot of lamination of the dough, which is basically taking the butter, wrapping it in dough, folding it over, rolling it out, folding it over again, rolling it out, waiting. It's a whole long process, and that's what makes all of those wonderful flaky layers, but it is a real pain, and so yeah, I'm glad that that's not the one that I'm going to make. I have made it before, it's really good, but it is a lot of work, which is why I'm so glad to mention today's sponsor, Wild Grain, because they take a lot of the work out of baking. Wild Grain is the easiest and most delectable way that I know of to get free croissants in every box. Those, of course, will be modern croissants, so if you want croissants from the 1850s, you're going to have to make those from scratch, for which you will need 2 tablespoons or 18 grams of active dry yeast, 2/3 cup or 150 milliliters of water, 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of whole milk, 10 cups or 1 kilogram of bread flour, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 2 well-beaten eggs. So first we are going to make our pre-ferment known as a sponge. Measure out 250 grams of the flour and add this to a mixing bowl with 250 milliliters of the milk and the yeast. Use a whisk to mix this until the liquid is fully incorporated, then cover it and set it aside to rise for about 45 minutes to an hour or until it's doubled in size. You don't want to let it go any more than that doubling in size because then you'll use all the yeast and it won't rise in the oven. But once it's doubled in size, add the rest of the flour, the salt, the egg, and the remaining milk and water and mix until the dough comes together. Begin to knead for about 15 to 20 minutes or until it becomes nice and smooth. Then set it back in the bowl, cover it up, and let it again double in size. This can take a couple of hours, or you can actually put it in the refrigerator overnight, let it rise for like 10 hours. It'll actually help the flavor, and you don't have to do all this in one day then. Once it's well risen, knock out the air and divide the dough up. And the size really depends on how big you want these croissants. It doesn't specify how big they're supposed to be. So I made some that are rather small, I made some that are rather big, and everything in between just kind of to experiment. There are also many ways to shape a croissant. There are old descriptions that have you make it into a circle and then roll it and curve it around. There are others that have you have a equilateral triangle, but my favorite, and frankly I think the easiest way, is to roll the dough out to about 1/4 inch thick and cut it into a long triangle, and then cut the base just a little and pull the ends so it's roughly the shape of the Eiffel Tower. Then begin to roll it up and curve it in on itself so it is the shape of a crescent. Then set the croissants on a baking sheet, cover them, and let them rise for another 30 to 45 minutes. Now, I looked at several other 19th and early 20th century recipes, and they all seem to have some sort of either egg wash or a sugar glaze on top. Most of the egg washes are actually egg yolk and milk, so that's what I'm going to be doing. What I did find interesting was that some of them are applied before they go into the oven, but then some of them are applied after baking, which will just leave like a raw milk and egg mixture on top, which I guess is fine, but it's kind of odd. So I'm going to go ahead and whisk some egg yolk with milk and then brush it over the croissants before setting them in the oven at 385 degrees Fahrenheit, 195 Celsius, and baking for 15 to 18 minutes or until they are a nice golden brown on top. Now, it is my belief that these croissants will be the missing link of croissant history. They are not buttery and
Missing
flaky
link.
like their modern version, but they're not going to be as sweet and crisp as their earlier version, an Austrian pastry known as the Kipfel.
Time for history.
Any history of the French croissant must begin with its Austrian predecessor, the Kipfel, or Gipfel. There are many, many different ways of spelling it. In fact, some of the earliest ways of spelling it are Chipfel or Chipfen, and those are what are said to have been given in 1227 to Duke Leopold VI, Leopold the Glorious of Babenberg, as a Christmas gift from the bakers of Vienna. This bread, whose name literally means mountaintop, is often thought as the precursor to the Kipfel, though we don't know what shape it was. It might have been a crescent. It doesn't actually discuss it that far back. It doesn't talk about the shape until the 1630s, when it was definitely crescent-shaped. And that brings us to the first and perhaps most enduring myth about the origin of the croissant. Picture this. 1683, and the Ottomans have surrounded the city of Vienna and laid siege for 2 months until, on September 12th, the famous winged hussars of the Kingdom of Poland arrive and, fighting beside the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, sweep the Ottoman forces from the field. In celebration, the bakers of Vienna bake a new bread and shape it, mockingly, into a crescent, the emblem which adorned the flags of the Turkish army. A wonderful story, and not too dissimilar from another story about a previous siege of Vienna, this time in 1529. Again, when the Ottomans were besieging the city, it happened a lot, but this time it's said that bakers made pretzels after hearing the Ottomans digging under the walls of the city. Now, neither of these stories have a grain of truth to them, or at least there's no reason to believe that they do, but it is nice to know that whenever the Ottomans lay siege to the city of Vienna, the world gets a new baked good. There's actually an alternative version of this story about the croissant that places the battle not in Vienna, but in Buda, which was half of Budapest, in 1686. But again, there's no reason to believe that the story is true, especially because we know that the Kipfel was already crescent-shaped before any of these battles were taking place. Also, because I'm talking about
Where'd
Vienna
these
and
stories
Budapest,
come
I wanted to
from,
let you
then?
know that next year, like a year from now, I'm actually going to be leading a river cruise on AMA waterways along the Danube, so if you're interested in joining, I'll put a link in the description. Now, if there are no period records to link the origin of the croissant shape to the Ottoman flag, well then why do so many people believe this story? Well, it seems to have started to crop up in the 19th century, and it was during a period when a lot of historians just kind of enjoyed making up stories about how things originated. Happened all the time. And then it gets a lot of detail around 1903 in something called the Baker's Book. The crescent, or Vienna Kipfel, originated with baker Peter Wendler and his wife, who had a bakery at number 841 Grünengasse, Vienna, at the time the Turks beleaguered the city. This baker had that patriotic, humorous idea to give his rolls the shape of the half-moon or crescent, the emblem of the Mohammedans. His crescents at once found a ready sale. Everybody wanted to devour the crescents from patriotic impulse. In the house above mentioned, a bakery has been operated since 1585 up to the present day. The specifics, I mean, how could it not be true with such details? Except for the fact that the baker in question, who did live and was a baker, died 3 years before the battle, so didn't happen. So the story isn't true. But what is true is that the Kipfel, the crescent-shaped Kipfel, was a very popular baked good at the time, and by the 18th century was being made of the finest Hungarian flour and could be found in all the bakeries of Vienna in different flavors like anise and cinnamon and vanilla, all delicious. But then how did this Kipfel make its way from Vienna to Paris? And again, here we have truth and we have fiction. And as is so often the case, the fiction is a lot more popular than the truth.
Nope. Go away.
Was brought to Paris with none other than Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was from Vienna, and she did bring a Viennese baker with her when she married the Dauphin Louis, who later became Louis XVI of France. And in the video that I did on Marie Antoinette, I mentioned a quote from one of her ladies-in-waiting, a Madame Campan, who said that the queen breakfasted on coffee or chocolate, and a kind of bread to which she had been accustomed in her childhood in Vienna. But the Viennese had dozens of breads to choose from, so who's to say that this bread was a Kipfel? Especially since there's no record of anyone else having eaten these breads except for Marie Antoinette, and they don't really make another appearance in Paris until about 50 years after she lost her head. Now, it's always nice to tie an origin story to a famous name like Marie Antoinette, but in this case, I think it's even more interesting that we actually know who did bring the Kipfel from Vienna to Paris. A man named August Sang. And here I have to give credit and just amazingness to this book. It's by Jim Chevalier, and I have never seen a book that has gone so in depth on a specific piece of baked good history as this book. So if you really want a deep dive into the croissant and its history, I'll put a link in the description to that book. It's really quite well written. Anyway, August Sang is the man who brought this baked good to Paris. But that's not what he was really known for during his lifetime, because he was famous for other things that had more notoriety in the 19th century, like owning a bank, owning a mine, and starting Die Presse, a newspaper which is still printed today in Vienna. But before all that, he was a disappointment to his father when he dropped out of school to join the military as an artillery officer. And at some point in the 1830s, he is said to have visited Paris and tried the bread and been decidedly unimpressed. See, Paris has not always been the bread mecca that it is today, because at that time, most of the leavening was done with sourdough, which I love sourdough, but back then it was thought of as kind of poor people bread, and it was chewy and dense, while breads in Vienna and places like England were using ale yeast or ale barm to leaven their bread, and you got a much lighter, softer bread from it. So Sang, seeing an opportunity to bring better bread to the people of Paris, went back to Vienna, gathered up some bakers, because he wasn't actually a baker, and headed back to Paris, where in 1838 or 1839, he and a fellow officer, Ernest Schwarzer, opened the Boulangerie Viennoise at 92 Rue de Richelieu. And it only took about a year for the bakery to take off. In November of 1839, the French newspaper La Presse announced that the Parisian public, who know how to appreciate good things, flocks to the Viennese bakery and patisserie, Rue Richelieu 92. The elegance of the stores, and above all, the exquisite merchandise offered there, will ensure the prosperity of this establishment. And later that same month, following the premiere of Hector Berlioz's Romeo et Juliette, they printed, "To tell the truth, what is most discussed following the Berlioz concert is the Viennese bakery, which attracts the crowds on the Rue de Richelieu. These exquisite and crunchy little loaves, framed by superb curtains, lit by brilliant candelabras, are a very pleasing picture to the eyes. This new way of composing music and making rolls is quite an event in Paris." Now, Sang and his bakery were making a number of baked goods other than the Kipfel, but it does seem that it was the Kipfel that left its lasting mark on the bakers of Paris. Though there are stories that he also invented the baguette, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence directly supporting that. What he did do was invent in 1842 a version of a steam-injected oven that is still used in a obviously later form in Paris and many bakeries today, that lets the inside of the bread get nice and soft and the outside develop a wonderful crust. But it was his Kipfel, at least at the time, that gave him some notoriety in Paris, and it wasn't long before other Parisian bakers started copying this and other Viennese breads that he was making. Before Sang, many writers lamented the poor quality of bread in Paris and really France as a whole. But just a decade or so after Sang came along, the Parisian is so spoiled that however limited his means, he will have none but the whitest bread. Many of the old kind are becoming obsolete or are superseded by pain anglais and by pain viennois. And it's around this time that the Paris bakers dropped the name Kipfel and started referring to the baked good simply by its shape of a crescent, or croissant. And within decades, the croissant had become very, very popular, and really the whole bread world of France seemed to have...
Wait. Does the name croissant just refer to the shape? Is that it? Ah, yes, look at my wonderful baked good, the crescent. Is that what it's like? Wait, what is crescent in French? I need to look this up later. It cannot just be croissant.
turned around. In 1872, Charles Dickens wrote a short piece called The Cupboard Papers, where he bemoans how, when it comes to bread and meat, the English show a wasteful and dismal monotony. But in France, the varieties, not only of form, but of solidity and flavor, are endless. From the prodigious loaves that are sold in Normandy to the dainty croissant on the boudoir table. Though the texture of the dainty croissant was still probably more like the Kipfel than a modern-day croissant because, again, still no butter. And even when butter starts to be introduced into the recipes in the late 19th century, it's included as it would be like a brioche dough, not laminated with flaky layers like the pastry that it is now. But regardless of the texture, they were everywhere. One newspaper even accused the croissant of eclipsing all other baked goods in France and said that it was imperative to save certain rare breads from oblivion since the croissant begins to replace them everywhere. But perhaps nothing shows the importance that the croissant had on the bakeries of Paris, on the people of Paris, than a possible baker's strike in 1891. The newspaper Le Gaulois insisted that Paris is good-natured. It is prepared to allow everything. Strike by omnibus drivers, strike by hairdressers, and even strike by laundresses. But should you touch its patisserie, stop it. Paris bares its teeth. The bakers of Paris were threatening to strike, and this could not stand. And it wasn't bread as a whole that was really the issue. It was the croissant that brought both rich and poor together. From the Bastille to the Arc de Triomphe, the cry rang out. This is how our Parisian women reasoned, and those from less wealthy neighborhoods spoke roughly the same language, for it was the croissant that was threatened. Croissant of a sou and croissant of 2 sous. One cannot imagine the importance of this item in the Parisian bakery. A house in our neighborhood sells 3,000 to 4,000 a day, and that's just to passing customers. Another, which is not very far away, sells more than 10,000. Fortunately for us today, the Parisian bakers got back to work. And it wasn't long, it was around 1905, that we first see recipes that give a rudimentary version of a buttery, flaky croissant with the lamination. Not exactly the same as today, but it's on its way. Ironically, today, a lot of times, croissants are not even crescent-shaped anymore, especially when they're stuffed with fillings like chocolate or raisins or almond cream. I even had one that was stuffed with a creme brulee cream. It was absolutely amazing, and I don't care that it wasn't shaped like a crescent, but it is interesting that the name really no longer applies to the shape, but to the style of bread. Whereas in the 1850s, it was less about the style of the dough at all.
Is a croissant still a croissant if it's not crescent-shaped? I mean, if you look at a croissant and it's crescent-shaped, you're like, oh, that's a croissant. But if you look at one that isn't crescent-shaped, you just say it's some kind of baked good. But you wouldn't immediately say that it's a croissant. It's the shape. It's the shape that gives it meaning.
And all about the shape. That's where it got the name croissant. And I am hoping that my croissant from the 1850s have kept their shape. Once they're baked, let them cool, and they are ready to eat. And here we are, the French croissant of the 1850s. It's kept its shape pretty well. Some did better than others. It looks really lovely inside. It's a little close. Maybe, like I said, I think I could have let it prove a little bit longer, but it's so soft. It's definitely more like a brioche, anything like a modern day croissant. Let's take off a piece here. I mean, it's just warm bread. It doesn't have a ton of flavor, you know, it's very plain. It's just bread. It doesn't have any butter in it. It could use some butter. It could use some jam or something on top, but It doesn't need it. It's just nice, soft bread. The texture is lovely. Very, very different from a modern croissant. A lot easier than a modern croissant, especially if you can get the shape. That's really what the whole point of this is. Anyway, make modern croissant. Go buy yourself a croissant. Go find one of those creme brulee stuffed croissants that I had. I can't remember where it was. Some bakery in New York, I think. It's amazing. Spend the rest of my life trying to find that croissant. Make croissants, eat croissants, have a croissant in your life, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Oh, okay. There's a French person here. In French, we don't usually call those other pastries croissants. We call them collectively viennoiserie, meaning from Vienna. The chocolate one you showed is pain au chocolat or chocolatine, depending on where you are. Others are often in fact called brioche. The spiral cinnamon roll is usually called brioche à la cannelle or roux à la cannelle. So even the French don't call like non-crescent shaped ones croissants. They just call them something else. I tell you, it's the shape that gives them meaning. The shape, I tell you. Alrighty, on that note, I'm gonna call it here. But yeah, thanks for stopping by, everyone. Hope y'all had fun. I know I did. But yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you to anyone watching the VOD, and thank you as always to lovely fortune tellers watching this before I stream. Okie doke, let's see who's on so I can go raid. Looks like Ruby is playing Repo. Guess we'll go say hi. Raid. Huh? Oh, there we go. Okay. Alright. Start raid. But yeah, thanks for stopping by. Remember to hydrate, rest up, eat tasty things, all that good jazz, and peace.